The plot of Gears of War 4 is the most low stakes the franchise has ever been. Ironic kind of, because it's probably the highest stakes ever for Xbox. With Epic Games no longer serving as its guiding hand, Xbox is left to see if the series can thrive under new leadership, with new characters, and a new story arc. The short of it is that the series can and will continue to thrive, and that's because Gears of War still makes for one hell of an action game. But the developer, the Coalition, doesn't always handle the transition fluidly, often struggling to strike a balance between new Gears and the ghost of its past. At the beginning of the original Gears of War, the Cogs are already engaged in a full-scale conflict. That original battle with the Locust, and later the Lambent, drives the entirety of the trilogy. The first game is self-contained, and things balloon from there. By the end of Gears of War 3, the scope of matters has grown immeasurably. Gears of War 4 takes a decidedly different approach. It begins, after the prologue that serves as a tutorial that is, with new protagonists JD, Del, and Kate trekking through the Sierra Wilderness. But looking to break into a Cog compound to steal a fabricator, a source of energy to power Kate's village. Comparatively, this is about as quiet as Gears of War can possibly be. There are some firefights against a new, aggressive robot enemy, but there's also time to ask questions. Why are the Cogs trying to kill JD and Del? What did those two do to become disavowed soldiers? How much more is there to learn about their past? It isn't long before that's largely washed away. Soon after, we encounter our old friend Marcus Phoenix, and the plot follows a more Gears-like direction. There's never anything as grand as the fate of humanity at stake, though. Or at least not that we're told. Maybe we'll get there in a few more games' time. Gears of War 4 is a more personal story. Family relationships are front and center in Gears of War 4. Recovering Kate's mom after she's been captured by the Locust-like swarm is the main reason for this journey. Tangentially, but probably more important to the player, is the strained father and son relationship between Marcus and JD. Marcus is none too happy that JD dragged him into this mess while he was enjoying his life of relative retirement. There's something more to it, though. With Gears of War 4, the Coalition is content to ask many questions, but sufficiently answer few of them. That's its most striking shortcoming. This is a game that's very obviously in service of a trilogy. A lot of plot threads are left hanging, even ones that are teased so often it seems impossible that they wouldn't be addressed. That will presumably come in a future game. But the best trilogies are the ones where each title stands on its own merits, and Gears of War 4 doesn't really do that. Instead, it aims to be 1/3 of a story that might eventually be good. It doesn't help matters that this game does very little to make JD a reasonably interesting character. Del is surprisingly funny, and Kate has a charm about her that's endearing. JD, from beginning to end, does almost nothing that makes him feel like a protagonist worthy of carrying this franchise. He doesn't even have the gruff mannerisms of his father. He just exists as a vessel through which Gears of War happens, and that's the most unfortunate possible outcome. There are also moments throughout the campaign when it's tough to tell if the Coalition is paying homage to the series' roots, or if they're retreading territory for lack of ideas. Act 1 ends with a terrifying scene that's reminiscent of General Ram executing Lieutenant Kim. Act 2 closes with a vehicle section that might end up as divisive as the infamous Burnt Rubber chapter, although surely not as difficult. Gears of War 4 has no qualms in drawing inspiration from its past works, and that's sometimes disappointing, sometimes comforting, and sometimes both at the same time. However, when classic Gears of War stuff happens, which is most of the time, it's generally excellent. It's important to remember that this is a series that not only popularized a lot of third-person shooter mechanics in the last decade of video games, but that it also executed them in an exhilarating way. The feedback loop of shooting, killing, ducking into cover, nailing an active reload, and shooting again is a process that continues to be tremendously satisfying. Even if the story leaves something to be desired, the Coalition proves that it knows how to craft an enjoyable game. The tone and setting is more consistent with the original Gears of War than any follow-up. Many of the chapters are set in dark, haunting environments that seem as if they lend themselves better to a horror piece rather than an action romp. At times, Gears of War 4 is a blend of both genres when it mixes distress, uncertainty, and danger. Other times it leans on over-the-top set pieces, like a trebuchet that rains fire to get its point across. It might not be as packed with memorable moments as previous Gears games, but anyone would be hard-pressed to assert that this installment isn't consistently exciting. A lot of that can be traced back to the tools of the trade, the weaponry. Apart from classic armaments that return, Lancer, Longshot, frag grenades, etc., the Coalition invented a good number of weapons that ever so slightly subvert the functioning of an existing weapon. There's a new shotgun, but this one fires twice. There's a new sniper rifle, but this one charges up when aimed and then deactivates when aimed for too long. The devious design of this sniper rifle in a game about popping in and out of cover is simply fantastic. While these weapons completely get the player through the minute-to-minute of Gears of War 4, it's the power weapons that are the most impactful. The Buzzkill shoots saw blades across the battlefield, ricocheting off of any surface they touch. The drop shot launches aerial bombs that dive straight down into an enemy's head. They're not exactly common to find, but they're a blast anytime they're used skillfully. All of this, the weaponry, the level design, the set pieces, the squishy enemies, is what makes Gears of War a pleasure to play. This installment carries the tradition on beautifully. If the story isn't always incentive enough to continue forward, the exemplary gameplay will be. It's easier to shoulder the burden of a lacking narrative when playing is far from mature. Gears of War, distilled to its purest form, and without obligation to provide a plot, is the competitive multiplayer. The standard Gears offerings like Execution, King of the Hill, and Warzone are all here and at 60 frames per second. Social and competitive matches take place across 10 maps. It's mostly standard fare, but like other games, it again works brilliantly. The places where the Coalition sought to leave its mark on competitive multiplayer seem to have turned out fantastically. New modes are the main innovations, specifically Dodgeball, Arms Race, and Escalation. Dodgeball is a tense back and forth as each death provides a player on the other team. This is the mode where heroics are most likely, as a 5-on-1 can turn to a 4-on-2, which can lead to an even 3-on-3. Arms Race starts both teams out with the boom shot, the game's most powerful weapon, and eventually works them down to the least useful weapon. It takes 3 team kills with each weapon to move on to the next one. Besides being a clever idea, Arms Race creates some interesting dynamics when, say, one team has long shots and the other has nashers. Lastly, Escalation is a best out of 13 rounds game where teams vie for control of 3 different zones. Capturing all 3 at once immediately ends the round, but sometimes it's wiser to hold down 2 and run the clock out. This is the mode that the Coalition pegs as having esports potential. Competitive multiplayer is proficiently handled, but it's not all that varied from what Gears of War has seen in the past, and that's perfectly fine. The same can't be said for this iteration of Horde. This is Gears of War 4's biggest overhaul, as it breathes new life into the cooperative mode. This version of Horde is a class-based affair where everyone has a job to do. The centerpiece is the Fabricator, a chest where energy is deposited and reinforcements are pumped out. Engineers are in charge of overseeing and managing the Fabricator. Scouts are little fast guys who scurry about the battlefield to collect drop energy and return it to the engineer. Soldiers act like normal Gears characters. Heavy spawn with power weapons. Snipers shoot things from a distance. Classes add a neat touch of variety to the mode, but it's really the Fabricator that changes its functions. Instead of rewarding those who hunker down and survive, Horde 3.0 incentivizes movement. Without doing that, the Fabricator will run dry, new protection can't be forged, and dead soldiers can't be revived. It's imperative that everyone play to their roles for the good of the team. Those without a crew will have the opportunity to sample Horde mode in the main story. There are a handful of defense sections that feel as if they are ripped straight out of the multiplayer and stitched into the campaign. It's not really representative of what Horde 3.0 is, and it feels like an awkward attempt to sell the player on the game's other features. Core Gears gameplay is always the best when you're the aggressor. These moments stand out as some of the worst in the campaign, despite featuring a mode that's excellent on its own. The Coalition is still in its relative infancy as a developer. Gears of War 4 is the first game that it can call its own. No doubt that there are missteps, mostly with regards to the narrative and the pacing, but there are a lot of bright spots too. Even if this is only an okay Gears of War game, it's still a fantastic video game. That says a lot about the pedigree of this franchise. The nature of Gears of War 4 is that we won't know its legacy until there are more games in the canon. That's frustrating now, but it'll hopefully be exciting later. This is a fine first showing, but it'd be nice to see the Coalition carve its own identity for Gears of War. Using Epic's foundation is understandable and expected, but it often feels like a crutch. Marcus's boy had grown up just like him. Gears of War 4 receives an 8 out of 10.